What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Nick 4K video. Today we're checking out a video from Joe Blow Originals, and the title of the video is Why Do James Cameron's 4K Movies Look So Ugly? So for me, this is just a funny title. This whole thing just blew up. If you didn't know, James Cameron, he did an interview recently and he talked about how people who pixel peep his movies are nerds who live in their basement. It was a complete lash out. I don't think he thought it was going to blow up the way it did, and it did. But James is a billionaire, and we're all going to still watch his movies, so, nothing really is going to happen from this. I actually did a video covering this topic already, but this video is going to be specifically going over, like, the transfer comparisons and stuff like that. But, from my perspective, though, I understand where he's coming from. I do think that maybe some people do end up pixel peeping a little too much. They're not enjoying the actual movie because they're looking at all the fine details. I have an OLED, so pretty much any transfer, whether it's good or bad, looks amazing on there, so I can't really complain much. I thought True Lies looked great. I thought Aliens and The Abyss looked great. I do think that maybe The Abyss and Aliens looked better as if they got more attention, but they all looked great on an OLED, so that's just my opinion. With that said, guys, let's jump in and see what he's got to say.
One of the most controversial stories among film fans in recent memory has no doubt been the James Cameron 4K restorations of a number of his classics. Throughout their home video history, some of his movies have been frustratingly unavailable, such as The Abyss and True Lies, which only ever came out in standard definition DVDs that weren't even 16:9 enhanced in the old days of home theaters. Fans should have been celebrating the fact that these movies were now available at long last, but once they made their digital debut, consternation among film fans reached a boiling point on social media, especially as far as True Lies went. Many posted screenshots claiming that Cameron had slathered AI all over the films to thoroughly change the way they looked, and indeed, as a fan who grew up watching movies like this in the 90s, True Lies looks, well, a little different. You see, Cameron enlisted the aid of a company called Park Row Post, which is owned by Peter Jackson. Some of their work over the years has been striking, with them allowing Jackson to use film clips that were over 100 years old in his World War I documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. He also used this on hours of Beatles footage for his Get Back documentary. Judiciously applied AI was able to make these vintage elements look new, and Cameron used some of this tech on the 4K restorations of his movies. Now, it should be noted that Cameron's films have always been somewhat controversial when they hit home video. Back in the year 2001, The Terminator was re-released on DVD in a pretty spiffy transfer, but the soundtrack was remixed in Dolby Digital 5.1 and the mono track was not made available, and a lot of fans took issue with the way that the movie sounded. Cameron, you see, has always been one that's been kind of obsessed with technology and has always been eager to bring his work up to date. However, this has sometimes caused some consternation among film purists. Studio Canal's 4K transfer of Terminator 2 Judgment Day has long been mocked for sporting a waxy digital look. When the 4K transfers came out in December, it was True Lies that received the most controversy. Now, let me explain this a little bit. True Lies would have never looked in 4K the way that some of the really huge blockbusters of that era look. You see, the film was shot in a format called Super 35, which was basically spherical. The reason James Cameron did this was that when his movies were transferred to home video, rather than just lop off the sides of the image like he would have to do had he shot it in Panavision, using spherical format, he was able to add extra information on the top and bottom of the screen, which made the transfers less of an eyesore. The problem is, the film stock was faster, so when they were blown up, there was a little bit of grain. You couldn't really notice this on VHS, you certainly couldn't notice it on DVD, and probably even in Blu-ray and an HD transfer, it wouldn't have really been that noticeable. But in 4K, the movie would have looked, not bad, but it wouldn't have looked great. Remember when Shout Factory put out a 4K edition of Point Break not too long ago? A lot of fans said that they didn't find the movie looked all that great or even much different than it did in HD, and the reason for that is the fact that that film, which was also produced by James Cameron, was actually shot in Super 35. So basically, if they had just put True Lies on 4K disc as is, it would have looked a lot like Point Break, and I think that film fans would have been complaining. They're complaining now, but they would have still complained, and they would have said, oh, the movie doesn't look as good as it should have, and they should have done something to it. So you really can't always win with these things. However, a lot of people think that James Cameron went way too far with True Lies, and indeed, some of the screenshots that are out there on X are pretty striking. And as somebody who grew up watching these movies, I mean, it can't be denied that Cameron really has done something akin to what film preservationist Robert Harris called in an email to me a revisualization, in which...
Okay, so before he gets into this, that's a good point. He made a good point that like maybe people who grew up with these movies are more affected by it. It's kind of like the Star Wars special editions. For me, I grew up with the special editions. I think I probably saw the originals like on VHS or whatever, but I grew up with the special editions. So as time went on and I learned about all the different things that George Lucas changed, it didn't really bother me as much because those were my movies, right? So it's one of those things like with True Lies or even Aliens or The Abyss, I had never even seen any of those until they came out on 4K. I was waiting for the 4K transfers of them. So I never even watched them. My first time was with the 4K transfer. So that makes a good point. Maybe that's why it doesn't bother me as much. Because these transfers were my first time with these movies, and therefore I don't have this preconceived notion of how these films were supposed to look because I didn't have anything before that, right? Like this is the first time, my first viewing. So that's a good point. That might actually have to do with a lot of the hate and criticism for this, because there's a lot of people, it seems like it's almost split, honestly, where people are just like, no, it looks really good, guys. What are you talking about? And then there's the other side that's like, no, it's DNR'd all the way up. It's one of those things where like, they talk about the camera technology and how like, well, he has to do this or it's going to look rough. That's understandable, but it's one of those things where like as a consumer, it's not my responsibility to make sure your stuff works, right? It's like if you go to a restaurant and you like your steak, let's say you like it rare, and then someone cooks it well done. Obviously, you're going to want to send it back. And then someone might give the excuse, well, I'm sorry, we have a new cook and we're trying to figure it out. And that's understandable, and I get the reason for why my steak wasn't done right. But that's not my responsibility to make sure that your guy cooks his food correctly, right? And now I got a free steak. I got a new steak. I got it for free, and you guys lost business. You know, that's not my problem. So it's one of those things where it's like, I understand the issue. I understand the reason for why you had to go that route, but that's not my problem. So I think James Cameron using the AI isn't to make it everything look digital like people have been saying. I think it's just because he made do with what he had. And if I had to choose between a blurry transfer that doesn't look that good anyways, or a 4K transfer that looks pretty good still, I'm going to pick the 4K transfer. That's just me. Maybe I'm alone in that thought, but like I understand his perspective at least.
Which he didn't change the negative of the film. He created an all-new digital version of the film, which, well, looks a lot different than it used to. If you watch True Lies now, it looks like it was shot last year, not 30 years ago, which, you know, is something that a lot of film purists don't really like. They want grain in their films. They want it to look like film. And if you watch True Lies on 4K, it certainly does not look like it was shot on Super 35. Another movie that this was very problematic for was James Cameron's Aliens, which has always had a very, very, very grainy look because the film was shot on very high-speed film stock. And in fact, when it was blown out to 70mm back in the 80s, it was notable for how bad people thought it looked because the grain was so pronounced. And even if you watch this movie on the Blu-ray HD transfers, you can see that Aliens actually has quite a bit of film grain to it, which has been removed in these new AI-assisted 4K transfers. To me, Aliens actually looks really good, and Robert Harris is one of the people that actually agrees with me, and he wrote in an email that he thought that Cameron definitely had the right to do these kinds of restorations as long as, you know, the original negative still existed, which was a problem with some of the films that Harris has worked on in the past, including Lawrence of Arabia. Film preservationists are really dedicated to negatives being restored. And indeed, sometimes if you don't properly store or restore a negative, movies could become lost. A good example of this is John Wayne's movie, The Alamo. Now you see, The Alamo was released in a couple different versions. There was a theatrical version which was short, but there was also a roadshow version 70mm, which was significantly longer. And the elements for that have apparently badly degraded over time to the point that they're now basically unrestorable. So that version of the movie, in effect, is lost.
That
the
sucks.
version of the Alamo that exists now by John Wayne is simply the theatrical version, which is kind of a shame because it's terrible to see any movie get completely lost.
Yeah.
So, the controversy surrounding James Cameron's 4K
That
transfers
sucks.
started to rear its ugly head again around the time that The Terminator got announced as coming out in a 40th anniversary edition that, of course, would be in 4K. So, this actually hasn't come out on disc or digitally yet, but I did see the movie in a theatrical release here in Montreal in 4K. And I have to say, It looks quite a bit like Aliens does, where all grain has been removed from the film, and I have to say that The Terminator was a movie that was relatively low budget at the time and never really looked like it was this huge budget film, which is kind of not necessarily the case now. I mean, Cameron didn't go crazy. He didn't change any VFX shots. He didn't really do anything to totally alter the way that the movie looked, but it looks smooth and slick in a way that I don't remember when I used to see it on VHS and even DVD.
That's a bad sign.
It would be nice if Cameron was to make the kind of more vintage-looking versions of his movies available too, so that home video enthusiasts could choose which one they want. The ironic
what he
thing
just said to me, what he just said there is it's another one of those situations with True Lies where people are going to be split down the middle. For me, I've actually got this question a lot, so I guess I'll finally answer it. But how do I feel film grain? I don't mind film grain as long as it's subtle. I really think that film grain is crispy. It adds texture to the movie, especially. I'd even say it adds like a nuance to the universe, so that you're watching kind of pulls you in a little more. But I do think there is a such thing as too much film grain, and sometimes too much film grain will pull you out of the movie. And one of the examples I'm going to make is the new 4K. Well, I shouldn't say new, but it's a 4K transfer of Stand By Me. There's a couple shots in that movie. The movie itself, the 4K transfer, looks great. Like, all the way through, almost looks completely great. But there are a few shots where the film grain is there in the sky. Like they're doing like a panning shot where the guys are all standing on top of a mountain and they're kind of looking down. And you see like the blue sky, right? But the blue sky isn't blue. It's like hazy because of how much film grain is in that shot. And I was just like, that's something that 4K DNR was meant for. Like, that's what the DNR was meant for, was to take out that type of film grain. As far as like subtle film grain, I think it's fine. Like I said, it adds texture to the film, but it all comes down to the level of film grain, because I do think too much is too much. And I know there's some boys out there probably watching this video too right now who love film grain, and the more they can get, the better. But I honestly think that is one of those things where it was something they dealt with during the time when the film was being made, right? And they didn't have a way to get rid of it. And now that there is a way to get rid of it, I think it's okay if they want to go back and get rid of it to a certain point. Because eventually, if you use that AI technology, and I'm sure like as time goes on, it's going to get better and better, and they'll be able to figure that out. But when you effectively digitally remove that noise, you also sometimes remove detail in the shot. And then you have to rely on AI to effectively fix that detail. And the detail sometimes becomes rubbery. And that's the issue with this. So really, it's about finding the middle ground. Clearly, James Cameron does not like film grain, and that's his perspective. And these are his movies, so if that's what he wants to do, that's what he wants to do. Regardless if you like it or not, it's his movie, right? So, I don't know. It's just one of those things where I understand the arguments for both sides. For me, subtle film grain is fine, but sometimes film grain is a little too much, and fixing it is the accurate way to deal with the situation, at least in my opinion.
I think that most mainstream audiences would probably choose these revisualizations because, well, they don't really know the difference, do they? It's really film preservationists and hardcore film fans that have kind of an issue with what he's doing.
Or nerds who live in their mom's basement.
It has to be said. He recently gave an interview where he addressed the 4K controversy, and well, let's just say he didn't mince words. In fact, he said the following: when people start reviewing your grain structure, they need to move out of mom's basement and meet somebody, right? I'm serious. I mean, are you kidding me? I've got a great team that does the transfers. I do all the color and density work. I look at every shot, every frame, and then the final transfer is done by a guy who's been with me for years. All the Avatar films are done this way. Everything is done this way. Gail Ann Hurd, who was the producer on the original Terminator as well as Terminator 2, actually told me in an interview that she fully supported James Cameron's right to do whatever he wanted with the visual look of those movies because, well, they're his movies. And if fans really had a problem with what he was doing, they should go out and make their own movies and then do whatever they wanted with them. She did acknowledge the fact that to some extent, film fans do feel a certain degree of ownership over those movies, but to her, it was really his prerogative as a director and filmmaker to do whatever he wanted because he is an auteur in the true sense of the word. All of which, of course, brings me to a point. Should a director ever be able to kind of engage in revisionist filmmaking? One of the worst examples of this, of course, is what George Lucas did with the original Star Wars trilogy. Steven Spielberg even kind of got involved with that a little bit too when he re-released E.T. on its 20th anniversary with all the guns removed by a CGI and replaced with walkie-talkies. He soon saw the light and restored the original version. But also, you've got things like Raiders of the Lost Ark having a new title, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I always found kind of annoying. As film fans, we don't like to see our classics.
That's a nitpick. Like that's one of those things. It brings the that's like, what is it? Original trilogy supremacists back in the day. They were complaining about how Star Wars isn't just Star Wars anymore. It's now Star Wars Episode 4. It's like, why, bro? Let it go. That's nitpick, in my opinion.
Messed with. And, Cameron, he never really changed anything fundamental about the films, but he definitely has changed the way they looked and are represented on home video. At the end of the day, of course, fans simply have to vote with their wallet. If you don't like what James Cameron has done with the 4K versions of his movies, simply don't buy them.
That's effectively what it is.
I do understand the fact that some film fans are kind of concerned with the way that AI could really change the way that movies are restored. In fact, there's already some evidence that AI is becoming a big part in the way movies are being transferred to these new 4K editions. A good example of that is what recently happened with Jaws 3D. Now, you see, Jaws 3D was shot in a very cheap way in which the 35mm film was kind of split in half and then doubled to create the 3D effect. So every version that we were seeing of Jaws that wasn't in 3D up until now was basically a transfer from a 16mm copy of the movie, giving it a very cheap, kind of crappy look. If you watch it now on 4K on Peacock or digitally, it looks wildly, wildly different because Universal basically used AI to make it look, well, like a much more expensive, slickly shot film. A lot of people are not going to be bothered by that, but a lot of film preservationists really don't like that, and in fact can nitpick and pick out some pretty crappy things about the transfers because, well, AI isn't always perfect, right? I mean, you could sometimes change the look of a movie, but then sometimes it has some rather unfortunate side effects, which, are being dug into on social media. But I think for the majority of film fans, they don't even really notice that what's happening, and I suppose that a lot of people would just be able to put on Jaws 3D and just be grateful for the fact that it doesn't look like crap, which is how it's always looked. So, the 4K transfers are controversial, and I have to say, as a film fan, I kind of do wish that Cameron put out two versions of the movies, the unrestored version and then these revisualizations, and I'd probably go back and forth as to which version that I wanted to watch. But truth be told, I would probably watch the new spiffy revisualizations of something like Alien, whereas I think I'd rather see more of the old school 35mm transfer of a movie like True Lie.
That's interesting. Okay.
But hey, that's just me. Everybody's got their opinion, and we want to hear yours. So let us know in the comments what you think of these James Cameron transfers.
Get another one, you moron.
I think I have one.
So there you go. That is the video from Joe Blow Originals. I already gave my perspective in this video, but I'll just kind of give a little outro here. I think this got blown a little out of proportion. I think the 4K transfers look really good. Like I said, I watched on an OLED though, so maybe that's different. But I thought it looked really good. I didn't notice anything super crazy. I'm sure if I paused the video here and there, I would have seen stuff. But ultimately, it looks good. It looks good, and I'd much rather have this 4K transfer over the DVD transfer any day. So that's just me. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think that this whole thing is completely blown out of proportion? Do you think it's not that big of a deal, and then when James Cameron said something, now it became a big deal? What do you guys think? Are you excited for the new Terminator transfer coming out, or do you think it's going to be rough? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, turn notifications for more. Oh, and if you guys find any cool ideas for future videos you want to see me do a reaction and review on, let me know in the comments below. And if I use your suggestion, I'll give you a shout out in that video. But thanks again for watching, guys. I'll catch you next one. Peace.